So I'm really delighted to introduce my colleague and friend Noah Whiteman today. Noah is an evolutionary biologist who studies the chemical ecology of plants and insects and other interactions as well, many other interactions. But he has a now famous 2019 Nature paper in which he used comparative genomics and CRISPR gene editing to show how monarch butterflies evolved their resistance to the cardiac glycosides that poison other insects in milkweeds, which monarch caterpillars, you probably know, feed on, and then how they sequester that for their own defense. He's probed many other systems, but in this case, he's unraveled the not totally straightforward evolution at the genome level of this particular co-option. And Noah can do this in part because he's at the cutting edge of all of these molecular genetic techniques, but also because he's an extraordinary, uh, like just a few in a century level natural historian. He really knows and loves and appreciates natural history. And he has also other extremely broad interests in human history, including human history. So he's written really quite an extraordinary book, So Delicious Poison. And as you'll hear in this book, he manages to weave his biological scholarship together with human history, and he'll tell us about that today. Thanks so much for speaking with us, Noah.
Well, thank you very much, Mary. Can everybody hear me? Mary, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, Mary, that I was blushing. I can't really tell because I'm red-green colorblind. But, yeah, it's I'm not sure I've ever been introduced by you before, so that was an honor. Your work also I learned about as an undergraduate on food webs, aquatic food webs, and you have been inspiring to me to push the envelope and to link the natural history with these cutting edge techniques that can allow us to divine things that we would not have been able to do without the combination of the two. So I really appreciate you spotlighting that, and how these emergent phenomena can arise when we really kind of push things together that maybe haven't been, right? Of
Right.
inquiry toward a more kind of consilience. And I think it's interesting you bring up the monarch thing because as a result of that, that got the book kind of churning, the idea of doing the book in my head. And as I write about in the book. And then a personal tragedy was the other thing that collided with that. So the death of my father from his substance use disorder, which in a way mirrored what the monarchs are doing, taking poisons to keep their enemies at bay. Well, so was he, but his were sort of, kind of mental demons. So, to cope with that, grief and trauma can sometimes yield good things. And I think this was a way of not only processing that, but also trying to understand the connections between our own lives and the lives of these natural beings out there. Um, and so this book came of that. And I also think it arose through my liberal arts training as an undergraduate. And being forced to take classes I probably would not have signed up for had I not had to fulfill certain requirements. And you'll see at the end how that kind of comes full circle. So I want to just thank the learners in retirement and the UC Berkeley Retirement Center for inviting me. This is great to be here to talk about the ideas in this book, Most Delicious Poison, which is Shakespeare from Antony and Cleopatra. That it's when Cleopatra was opining for Antony, who was away at war, and she commands her handmaiden Charmian to bring her the mandragora tonic so she could sleep away his absence. And the mandragora is the mandrake, which is a member of the Solanaceae that contains scopolamine, which is a soporific drug. And so Shakespeare was aware of the uses, of course, of the mandrake. And she said, "Bring me my most delicious poison." And so in that kind of encapsulates the two-sidedness of this poison drug kind of dichotomy that we and all other creatures that interact with these molecules face. And so the book is really sort of focuses on that two-sidedness or walking down that knife's edge, as we constantly do. And you'll see just in this little tableau, which is a play on these Dutch Golden Age vanitas, this book cover that was computer generated, but we constructed it very carefully, as you might imagine. And the things in the book that or the objects there show up in the book from this. This was actually a classic thing in a lot of these Dutch Golden Age Vanita, this citrus fruit, usually an orange, with a twist going down, right? The spiral. And the idea of that also has a duality, which is that, to get to the sweet flesh of the orange, you have to get through the bitter peel and pith. So, right. And of course, the Vanitas were really this kind of Protestant idea that we're all going to die, even rich people. And so if you can be vain, you can pursue these vanities, but everyone's going to die. So there's always a skull, there's always a candle with a snuffed out flame with smoke rising from it. And I think the book is also about that. So all these dualities is sort of what unites the book. A stein of beer, an opium poppy with latex seeping out of it, a black pepper mill, right, which was black gold, the first spice that was really pursued by the Portuguese when they landed in Calcutta on a ship, right, Vasco da Gama. And we even have a Sonoran desert toad, which makes 5-MeO-DMT, the psychedelic, and then psilocybin mushrooms, which of course produce psilocybin. And then we have a cigarette, which has tobacco in it, which has nicotine, a more potent drug than strychnine if taken orally. And then we even have a coffee or tea mug. And then if you look carefully, you can see a monarch butterfly there resting on the on the lip of the mug. And that is also a central part of the story of these poisons. And then as Mary said, that some of our research that we have done. So with that, I'll kind of dive right in. So the first slide, when I give this presentation in person, usually the tech assistant is like, "Is this a screensaver?" And I say, "No, this is my first slide." And they say, "What is that?" And I say, "Well, what does it look like to you?" And I would say 50% of the time they say, "Oh, that's Saturn. That's the planet Saturn. That's the rings of Saturn." And that is true. So this is a picture, a photograph taken by the Cassini spacecraft. Which was a play on the earlier Voyager spacecraft that swooped by Saturn. And of course, Carl Sagan set up this photo, as many of you know, not this particular one, the one before, and then the Cassini mission recapitulated it. But the idea of it was that we could look at Earth in the context of the solar system. And, look at that dot, that's here, that's home, that's us, and that little blue dot is us. And that really does put things in perspective. And what I want in the first part of this talk for you to think about is try to imagine that you are on an alien spacecraft hurtling towards Earth, and you know where you're going, you know that there's life there, and you've detected it with your spectroscopy, and you want to know more about it. And so as you are taking on the gravity of Saturn and using that as a catapult to get you to Earth, this is what you'd see. Now, this is going to come back later in the talk. So I want you to remember the rings of Saturn, okay? So keep that in mind, but we're going to pass toward Earth now, and we're going to get really close to Earth, and we're going to pass by our own moon. And this is that famous Earthrise photo that Bill Anders took on Apollo 8. And this is the orientation in which he took the photo. And what I like about it, because normally you see it tilted on its side, so it looks like Earth is rising above the moon. But this happens to be the orbit they took around the moon. And what I like is that if you look carefully, you'll see that this is actually South America. And so north is up. And that's why I like this photo, right? Because it's sort of like the globe that we see, which is totally arbitrary, but it sort of matches the idea of our planet as sort of in this absolute up-down reference. But the other thing I want you to notice is that you see that, of course, it's this Earth is this beautiful blue-white marble, but there's also the beginnings of green that you can see, which is, of course, chlorophyll on land from tree leaves. And as you zoomed in on South America, this is the northern half of South America, and of course, the Amazon basin. And you would see, if you could see through the clouds, you would see even more green coming into view. And then, maybe you would start realizing that the vast majority of biodiversity on Earth is on land, not in the water, not in the oceans, even though it's an ocean world. So what is up with that? So you zoom in even more, you see one of the reasons why there's a lot of green, and very large creatures are making this green. What are they? Now, maybe you're sending a drone out at this point, and then you would start making out the canopy of this amazing rainforest in the Amazon, and you would see, yeah, it's green, but it's varying shades of green. There's a lot of diversity there in the shape of the trees, in the shape of the leaves, in the color of the pigments that are absorbing light from the sun and reflecting what they're not absorbing back, at least some of it. And if you sent in a little, even smaller drone, what you would begin to see is one of the reasons why maybe there's so much diversity on land, and that is that most species of life on Earth are either a plant or an insect that eats them. And about half of all insects are herbivorous, which means that they pretty much only feed on the living parts of plants. And this dynamic between plants and their insect enemies primarily, but not exclusively, because there are mammals that eat plants, of course, and many pathogens, single-celled organisms that attack plants. But if you just look at the macroscopic stuff, the insects and the mammals, but especially the insects, you'll see that there's a great diversity of form here, in the shapes of them, in what they eat, in the colors of them. Some of them blend in really well. They're cryptic, and they're avoiding predation, detection by birds and things like that. And others are brightly colored, like this leafhopper, like this grasshopper, like this monarch butterfly caterpillar that I took a photo of in my backyard. And even if you look closer, you'll see on that milkweed, you see that little orange thing right there? That's an aphid that is called the oleander aphid. And that is also colonized milkweed and also has these bright colors. And these bright colors, often when we see them in both sexes, that we can say, well, they probably evolved to warn predators not to eat them. They're co-evolving with the sensory system of the predators. So they may not even be able to see their own colors that they're warning, that they're signaling to, but the receiver can see it. So this is one of the amazing things about the signal receiver dynamics. So if you look at all these insects and you say about half of all living insects are herbivorous, that's a tremendous amount of diversity. How did that come to be? And my colleagues, over the last, I would say, 50 years of studying this phenomenon, came up with the hypothesis that it's really the ecological interactions, the antagonistic interactions between herbivore and plant, the consumed and the consumer, this coevolutionary arms race or trench warfare, that may have resulted in the diversification of each through this dynamic, because the plants don't want to be eaten. That is not good for them. Their fitness goes down. The number of seeds they can produce, the amount of pollen they can produce goes down if they're attacked by the herbivores, because the herbivores are taking away the ability of the plants to photosynthesize. And that's not good from the plant's perspective. So the plants evolve defenses. Now, the problem with being a plant, there are many virtues of being a plant. You can cut off a limb and it will survive or grow a new one. But the problem of being a plant is that you cannot move yourself very fast. Maybe you can if you're a vine. All plants do move when they grow. There's taxes, right, that they have. They can twist and turn, but they cannot uproot themselves and move. And animals can. So animals have this advantage in terms of escaping enemies. Plants do not. So what has evolution done in order to protect plants? Because from that photograph that you saw, the earth is very green. The terrestrial realm where there's water is very green. So somehow plants have been able to deal with this. And it's not just on their own. They have helpers from a trophic level above, as Mary knows. So they have predators and parasitoids that will feed on the herbivores. And sometimes there's partnerships that form between the plants and those enemies. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that is definitely true. If you see a chickadee in your backyard, that bird might be eating 1,000 caterpillars a day to feed its babies when it's nesting. So this is amazing, right? Like that this little creature can do this. So that bird is really helping the plant survive, right? Enhancing its fitness. So I study these dynamics because I think they're so important in explaining the diversity of both the number of species that we have and the great diversity in form that we see. And so that has really fascinated me. And now plants have evolved these sophisticated ways of defending themselves that you wouldn't know unless you tasted a plant and tasted the poisons, which you all have, maybe even today. We'll talk about that. But if you're a little caterpillar and you're small, remember it's the dose that makes the poison, right? So plants are putting in their leaves things like mustard oils. Say you bite a radish, you get that spicy, peppery taste, or you at a sushi restaurant, you take a little bit of that green wasabi, right? And it lights up your nose. Those did not evolve for you to enjoy or receive pain from and enjoy, which is a whole other thing, right? They evolved to prevent things from eating those plants. And they are toxins that benefit the plants in the presence of the enemies. And this is an example of one of these mustards. That's why I use that as a cursory entree into this, is that this is the genetic model plant of Arabidopsis thaliana, which just happens to be a little weedy mustard from Eurasia. And it was the first plant to have its genome sequenced. It's like the fruit fly or the lab rat of the plant world. You can order a mutant of any gene in this plant from a center. They'll send it to your lab. You can grow it up and you can understand what that gene did by its absence. So this is an amazing model plant. And what the scientists did here is they engineered this little Arabidopsis to have a green fluorescent protein um, in its genome, a gene that encodes that, and that is fused to another gene that is involved in the production of glutamate and calcium signaling. And so glutamate is a very important neurotransmitter in animals, but plants also use it as a signaling molecule. And what is happening here is when this little caterpillar that you can see now, see its little head there, and you can see the body of it, it is munching away at that leaf. And what that plant is doing is as soon as that chewing starts, the plant detects that it's being wounded and sends this glutamate signal from cell to cell, almost like a nerve impulse. And calcium is being tracked here, and that's what the bright color is. So this is showing that the plant is perceiving that it's being wounded. It is sending a systemic signal to leaves that haven't even been wounded. And in those leaves, the plant is inducing the production of the mustard oil precursors that I just mentioned, to the point where some of these plants can increase their glucosinolate concentrations, which are the precursors to the mustard oils, by 30-fold the next day. So, and the idea of that is they're expensive to make, right? So they only really want to do it if there's damaging herbivores present. And so plants kind of have this both constitutive and inducible toxins that they kind of tweak depending on their circumstances. So they're sitting ducks in a way because they can't move, but they've evolved these amazing invisible defenses. And the story of nature and the story of my book, The Story of Humanity, is that we've all tapped into these molecules for our own good, or sometimes I would say for better or for worse. So the real lesson here, this is my favorite New York Times article from 2009, is sorry, vegans, Brussels sprouts like to live too. Now they're mustards as well, right? And so the truth is, yes, plants want to live. They have a great life force, right? That's been selected for. So do they feel pain? No, I wouldn't go that far. Can they tell they're being damaged? Can they perceive that? Absolutely. And have they evolved ways of trying to prevent that from happening? Absolutely. And we have benefited from that in many ways, because about half of our drugs come from nature, and in particular from plants. And some of those are here. You'll recognize the names. The structures don't really matter, but they're kind of, just think of the structures as chicken wire, okay? Different kinds of pieces of chicken wire. And this is the organic chemistry of life, okay? So but molecules I already mentioned, like strychnine, which is this famous toxin that probably was used to poison Jane Stanford from Stanford University, right? That's made by a tree. Cocaine is made by a different tree in South America. DMT, which I sort of mentioned, I mentioned 5-MeO-DMT. DMT is a dimethyltryptamine, which is a psychedelic that plants make, that many different species make. Delta THC is what makes marijuana marijuana. The CBD in marijuana doesn't result in a high, but it does result in perhaps a calming effect, but it's a different molecule. Cinnamonaldehyde is what gives cinnamon its spice. Piperine is what gives black pepper its peppery taste. Some of you may have had your life saved by Taxol, which is an anti-cancer treatment, a drug that's very widely used. And a precursor of that is made by all yew trees. And it was first discovered in the Pacific yew through an NIH screen thank you, NIH, of trees kind of randomly. And so this is an example of how sometimes funding basic research in these screens that seem just like fishing expeditions can result in something really important. And then the four on the bottom are what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk. And these are alpha-pinene, caffeine, myristicin, and morphine. And so they're going to be my focus today. And that's going to give you a sense of the kind of the way the book, the arc of the book. So, and I thought the other thing I would do is try to give you examples of some of the chapters. So this is chapter 3, and I kind of split the book up into different natural product classes, not completely, but I tried doing that to give it a little bit of organization. And this chapter is on terpenoids, and terpenoids are the most diverse class of natural products known. Of course, nobody knows how many natural terpenoids are out there, but probably somewhere between 50 and 100,000 have been described already, okay? So these are incredibly important molecules, and many of them we encounter on a daily basis in our food and in some of the medicines that we take. And if you walk outside in the Bay Area and you take a deep breath, you are inhaling some of these terpenoids, and they are making your life better for the most part. And so I'll walk you through one of them. And in the book, I talk about, kind of being up in the Oakland Hills there right during the death of my father, trying to make sense of it all. And it was very soothing to be up there with the beautiful smells from the eucalyptol, even if it's from an introduced tree, the Tasmanian blue gum, it still smells really good. But the alpha pinene is that emitting from these, things like redwoods and Doug firs, that wonderful smell that, it's so good that candle makers put them in those scented candles, which I don't like myself. I prefer the natural alpha pinene, but it is very soothing. And this is a picture of a coast redwood, someone gazing up at it, an illustration from the book that Julie Johnson made with that very simple structure of the alpha pinene. And you can see the dashed lines above that piece of chicken wire. It just means there's a little triangle up there. So it's sort of a little dashed showing you that that's sitting above that six-membered ring. And the amazing thing about alpha pinene is that it binds to an inhibitory receptor called the GABA A receptor in our brains. And so when the little insects are eating the redwood and encounter alpha pinene, and I should say almost all conifers make alpha pinene, the bristlecone pine, which is the oldest individuals of any organism in the world, are probably bristlecone pines. They make a lot of alpha pinene, which has protected them from bark beetles for the most part. So other gymnosperms are more susceptible to bark beetles, but bristlecone pines make a lot of alpha pinene. So it's this great defensive molecule, and it binds to the GABA A receptor. And in humans, when we drink alcohol, that ethanol binds to the GABA A receptor too. And those are found in inhibitory neurons, those receptors. So when they fire, it kind of puts you to sleep. It creates this soporific effect, this effect of calm. So when you give rats or mice alpha pinene pills, it slows them down. And of course, if you think about this from the perspective of evolution, this is a great insecticide. And that is why we think it mostly evolved at high concentration, because it's putting these insects to sleep so that they don't continue to feed. And in fact, my lab has studied the effects of different kinds of terpenoids on the GABA A receptors we've looked at resistance to those toxins over deep time, engineered them into fruit flies with collaborators, and found that they actually are linked to increased diversification rates in species that evolve resistance to these things. So this arms race we can see over deep time, over 300 million years. So the other thing about this is that the GABA A receptor is the same receptor that Ambien binds to, and some of you may use Ambien to fall asleep. So benzodiazepines, benzos, they also bind to GABA A. So this receptor has been a target of both natural and synthetic molecules that trees have evolved to keep insects away, and that humans have co-opted that same kind of biology and chemistry. And you'll see that pattern sort of mirrored throughout the story of humans. Now, this is a really incredible fossil of the oldest sequoia fossil known on the planet. And this gives you a sense of how ancient these dynamics are. So this is a rock, right, from Inner Mongolia. It's been dated to the Middle Jurassic. It's about 170 million years old. And it looks like you could have gone outside to a coast redwood, pressed it in concrete, and just handed it to someone. I mean, it's absolutely amazing that the needles, the branch structures, they're pretty much the same as they are now in these coast redwoods. And the other really cool thing about this fossil is that some of the specimens have insects preserved next to them. So you can see this beautiful hemipteran over here, right? We know it's hemipteran. It's got this piercing, sucking mouth part. Now, was it interacting directly with the redwood? We don't know. But the point of this is to show that these things have been together, at least potentially interacting for hundreds of millions of years. And then as I was doing research for the book, the thing that was shocking was to realize that the rings of Saturn have been dated, the origin of them, based on the rate at which the dust from the rings is falling into the atmosphere is getting pulled through gravity down to the atmosphere of Saturn. So Cassini had probes that it launched that detect this sort of dust fall. But the truth is, the rings are basically 98 or 99% ice. So those rings you see are basically made of ice and a little dust. Um, and the date of those, the sort of when the rings formed, was calculated based on the rate fall and the mass of the rings as they are at present. And what's amazing about this is that that fossil on the left is older than the rings of Saturn have been estimated to be. So life on Earth was flourishing before something that probably all of you thought, except the astronomers, because this is a smart crowd, probably all of you thought the rings of Saturn were just there, right? For a long, much longer than anything could have been alive on the planet, our little blue dot. And the answer is no, you're wrong. The life had been there actually, right, for billions of years longer than those rings. So this story, this ancient coevolutionary story, it's not a new thing. And because of that antiquity, it demands our attention, right? Just like the rings of Saturn do. Okay, so we'll switch from terpenoids and alpha pinene, and we'll go to abiding alkaloids this next chapter. And these chemicals, which alkaloids is a word that is derived from the Arabic word for from the ashes of plants. And, so think about you burn a plant, you create ashes from it. That there's a substance there that can be used, right? So it's like this great word. And the idea of alkaloids, really, they're kind of this diverse class, but most of the molecules contain at least one nitrogen atom. And that is important because nitrogen is coveted by nature, especially living things, right? They need nitrogen in order to make DNA and proteins, just like they need phosphorus. Those two elements are often limiting in most ecosystems. It's nitrogen or phosphorus, right? So this is important because you have to think of why a plant would make such a strange molecule that it is not using to directly grow, right? It doesn't use the alkaloid. You'll see in a minute the example I'll give. The first one is caffeine. You'll see all these nitrogens. Look how many nitrogens are there. 1, 2, 3, 4 in a single caffeine molecule. It could have put those nitrogens into making DNA and proteins for its tissues. It could have made more seeds. It could have made more pollen. It could have grown more. Why would it do this? So in the end, it's really about us. And this is why I showed a picture of a coffee cup here with a pour over. And you can see there's a paper filter at the top of that cup, which is, I think, a great way to drink coffee. And one of the reasons is, and this is in the book too, the two most important LDL cholesterol inducing molecules known in the human diet come from the coffee bean. One is called cafestol and one is called kawiol. They do not make it through a paper filter. But if you drink unfiltered coffee, you will consume these two terpenoid diterpene alcohols, and you will increase your LDL cholesterol level probably. And to the point where in Scandinavia, where they were drinking Scandinavian boiled coffee for a long time, that was linked to increased cardiovascular events in men. And so those chemicals were identified eventually through its clinical trials to show that they induced LDL cholesterol production. So if you drink unfiltered coffee, if you use a French press, that will increase your absorption of these two diterpene alcohols and likely raise your LDL cholesterol. But the thing that we're after is the caffeine, the alkaloid that makes its way through the filter. That's what we want. unless you drink decaf, which is a whole other story. But people who drink decaf, they were usually drinking caffeinated coffee before, right? They get used to the taste. There's this operant conditioning thing that happens, and they like it. Well, it turns out that caffeine, it wasn't made for us. It was here, hundreds of millions of years probably before humans were around. It's a natural insecticide. Now, this is a funny New York Times article from what does it say? From 1984. It says caffeine is natural insecticide, scientist says. And I thought, would anyone write an article with that title today? Scientist says. With this state of the world that we're in? My answer is no, they wouldn't. But they did in the 1980s, right? There seemed to be more trust in scientists then. But in this article, James Nathanson, who was a professor at Harvard Medical School, it was such a big deal. They reported in the New York Times that caffeine is a natural insecticide. Well, what he did were these incredibly clever experiments building on this idea of like, why would a plant make a nitrogen-rich molecule that it's not using for its own, direct reproduction? What is benefiting the plant from making this? And the answer, one of the answers, is that it is an insecticide. It's a great way to keep insects off your leaves and flowers and fruits and out of your seeds in the case of a caffeine bean. And what he did as an experiment was very clever. He took advantage of the fact that tomato plants do not make caffeine naturally. And there's a specialist herbivore that you probably have all seen called the tomato hornworm that attacks tomato plants. And there are these big green caterpillars that will eat your tomato leaves. And they turn into these beautiful hovering hawk moths that might come to your petunias. So, but these tobacco hornworms normally don't interact with any plants that make caffeine, at least in the caterpillar stage. And what he did is he sprayed caffeine on these tomato leaves to varying degrees. He had control, which had no caffeine. He had 0.1 gram percent caffeine, 0.3% gram caffeine, 1% gram caffeine, and 3% gram caffeine, gram percent. And the 1 to 3% is about what you get, depending on what kind of tea you're drinking and what kind of coffee you're drinking, about what you would find in tea or coffee beans. Okay. And he put caterpillars on each of these. And you can see the control ones. The caterpillar liked it so much, it's hard to see from this fuzzy photo, but this caterpillar turned into a pupa. In other words, it made it through metamorphosis. And so it loved the leaf. It just ate it all and did its thing. So you start adding a little caffeine and you start seeing the slowing down of development of that caterpillar. So now we have a caterpillar, not a pupa. And same here, but it's even smaller here. Do you see that? And there's more leaf material left behind. Then we have 1% caffeine, and the whole leaf is still there. You see these little holes that the caterpillar's made? So it's attempted to feed. And then it eventually, the reason you don't see a caterpillar is that it's so small and then it dies. In both cases, the caterpillars died, and it wasn't because they were being starved. So he also did very careful experiments to show this. So eventually, he revealed in this paper that the caffeine itself was insecticidal. And the mechanisms are now known for why that is the case. They're binding to both adenosine receptors and these phosphodiesterases. So the mechanisms of toxicity are absolutely known. Caffeine is a great natural insecticide, which is, kind of shocking, right? Because we love it so much. Now there's another layer to this. I like to tell this story of like, oh, plants are using these chemicals to defend themselves. It's really not always that simple. Now, natural selection works in amazing ways, and plants are amazing things. And so, they, as we said before, they want to live too, right? And it's not just about not being eaten. Sometimes plants want to attract animals to themselves, right? We all know this because flowers, these beautiful things, right, that are with fragrant volatiles wafting into the air with bright colors of fruits. The plants can't see the colors of their fruits. Why are they red? Why are they orange? Well, they're attracting animals to disperse them. The flowers are beautiful. They have a nectar reward for animals that are pollinating them, or they have a pollen reward that's full of protein. And in the process, they'll get outcrossed and pollen will move. Their fitness will go up. And so, two plants, at least in different lineages, put caffeine in their nectar at levels, at least in one case, that are as high as the caffeine level you would get in Nescafe, the terrible instant coffee. I shouldn't say terrible if Nescafe is listening. The instant coffee that I have used in the field, I should say. The levels there are about the same as they are in one of the Coffeus species. So this is mean caffeine concentration on the y-axis. And here's caffeine concentration in a variety of Coffeus species, including Arabica, which is my favorite kind of bean. And then we have citrus also puts caffeine in its nectar. And a lot of people didn't know this. And the question is, why would the plant be doing this? So these researchers showed that the plants are putting caffeine in their nectar at levels that are below the bitter rejection threshold of bees that are visiting the flowers. It's enough to cause the bees to have a neurological response, but it's low enough so that they don't stop drinking. And what this effect has on the bee is that it enhances the pollinator, the bee's memory of the reward that it got at the flower. And it will come back more often. And if they're honeybees, they will recruit their sisters to those plants. And so they're getting visited more than they normally would, which is really good from the plant's perspective, and maybe not that great from the bee's perspective, because at some point the pollen's going to run out, the nectar's going to run out, it's going to become inefficient. So this is an amazing way that that plants are manipulating the insect mind with these chemicals. It's not just that they serve this anti-herbivore function. Like most traits, they're multifunctional, and right, we never really know exactly why they evolved, but we can try to do experiments to tease apart the functions that they play now. And so when we look deeper, it's like, oh, well, we knew that the coffee beans were containing caffeine to keep seed predators away, but look, they're using the same chemical to lure animals in. And again, we have this two-sided thing, right? But in both cases, the plant has the edge here, right? Now, there's a way around it, of course, and that is to evolve resistance to caffeine. And that is why probably the most important pest of coffee in the world is the coffee berry borer beetle, which lives in the seeds of those coffee plants and destroys them, and probably causes over $1 billion a year in damage to the global coffee industry. They're completely immune to caffeine. And we now know why, thanks to researchers at the Lawrence Berkeley lab. And that is because they have bacteria in their gut that detoxify the caffeine. You take the bacteria away from the little coffee berry borer beetle's gut, the coffee berry borer beetle dies of caffeine poisoning. So there we have another layer. We have this other player in this web, this toxic web that allows these beetles to specialize and overcome this very potent toxin. So you can see even with one chemical like caffeine, those nitrogens, why are they there? We can ask that question and we can have this multifarious answer if we look closely. Now, I know again, it's all about us, right? Like that's a cute story with the bees and everything, but what about me? So this is a really amazing study. Now, what I will say before I even bring up the details is that this caveat emptor, that we cannot ever control for selection bias in epidemiological studies. We can never say in an epidemiological study that X causes Y, okay? But we can at least point out that there's a correlation in one direction or another, and that invites further scrutiny and experiments. I just want to say that. So, I dug into this literature because, as all of you, sometimes I open the New York Times or not picking on them, any newspaper, and there'll be a study that comes out that says, coffee is associated with living longer. And then next week it's, nope, guess what? It shortens your life. So we all see this, whether it's red wine or coffee, right, or other things, it can be very confusing. And the reason is, again, I think, is that these studies are very correlational. They're very hard to do. It's hard to isolate variables when you're not doing an experiment. In fact, it's impossible, right? So I think that's the issue. I just want to throw that out there. But having said that, this was a study done of about 51,000 women tracked over a decade. At the beginning of this study, they were all screened for depression symptoms, and none of them had clinical depression when the study started. And they were just tracked over 10 years. And the questions they asked included how much caffeine they consumed, which was cups per day of coffee. And this relative risk of clinical depression is on the y-axis here. Can you all see that? So one is the reference, and that is people who basically didn't drink any caffeinated beverages. And then as caffeine consumption went up, you can see it's sort of the same, more or less, it's around 10% reduction in depression risk when you get to about 3 cups a day. And then 4 cups a day, it drops down to 20% reduction risk for depression. So that means that the nurses in this study were 20% less likely to develop depression symptoms if they drank 4 cups of coffee a day or more. Now, this might seem like, okay, again, we can't prove that it was the caffeine itself that was reducing depression risk. Although I wake up in the morning and think, yeah, that's why I'm doing it. So, I think it's like, yeah, we kind of know that it's doing this to us, right? It's elevating us. But, there could be a placebo effect, and it's right, it's a warm beverage. But what they also did in this study, and similar ones, was they looked at people who drank decaf, right? Because that has all the other things that coffee has except caffeine. And those people, no matter how much they drank, did not have any change in depression risk. Now, there might be something about people who drink decaf, because why would you do that? But there is, I'm just teasing. There is this interesting thing there, right? That maybe that's a decent control. That they did not, drinking decaf didn't change depression risk. Only people who drank caffeine containing coffee did. That's interesting. And then maybe the more kind of surprising thing I would say is that a similar study was done on both doctors and nurses for about 10 years, and that study was on suicide risk. Now, thankfully, not as many people committed suicide that as had depression, right? So the sample size, right, is small of people who, fortunately, who people who committed suicide. But in this very large study of about 100,000 people, they tracked, and they found a 50% reduction in suicide risk associated with drinking, multiple cups of coffee a day in a dose-dependent manner. Again, we cannot prove cause and effect there, and we don't know if it's the same mechanism, if it exists, as with the depression reduction, but it's telling. And this is amazing. If I told you that there's a drug that will reduce suicide risk by 50% in the population and depression risk by 20% in the population. This is, if you think about this is the implications are quite extraordinary if it's true that there's a link, and we don't know if there is, but it's really amazing. So even though, we like to think of ourselves as like, well, I don't take any medication. Well, that's true. You might not, but you kind of are if you're drinking caffeine, right? It's definitely having a pharmacological effect on you. And the other side to this is that caffeine itself can kill people. So this is a sad story of a teenager from Australia who was making a shake and had a packet of caffeine, and apparently didn't know how much was in there, and sadly put it in his shake, and drank it, kissed his parents goodnight, went to bed, and never woke up, and died of caffeine poisoning. And this case resulted in the banning of powdered, freely available caffeine for sale in stores in Australia. And a similar thing has happened, sadly, in the United States. Actually, someone of a similar age who did the same thing and died of a caffeine overdose. And so that led to the banning of sort of powdered, freely available caffeine in the United States, too. So this illustrates that these chemicals were not made for us. We are on a knife's edge when we use them. Yes, we're very large animals. Humans are huge, right? If we think about in the grand scheme of things of all the animals on the planet, but we're still susceptible to the toxic effects of these, and we have to remember that. Okay, so we've done alpha-pinene, we've done caffeine. Now we're at myristicin. Myristicin is this beautiful molecule here, and myristicin is what gives nutmeg its beautiful flavor. And this is a picture of a nutmeg seed here, right, with ground up there. We're about ready to put it in our eggnog. And where does nutmeg come from? It comes from a beautiful tree, really, that is native and endemic to the Moluccas, the Spice Islands in what is now Indonesia. And that was the only place they grew originally. And here's a picture of a nutmeg fruit. And you can see that there's a seed in here, but it's covered by this bright orange thing. That orange thing is called an aril. And that aril is a lipid-rich, a fatty-rich layer of tissue that the dispersers of those fruits are after. And the spice mace comes from that aril that surrounds the nutmeg seed. Okay, and mace has its own special flavor because there are different chemicals in the aril. Now, what is this myristicin doing for the nutmeg? Well, before we get to that, I'll just point out that nutmeg can kill too. This sad story is of a woman who committed suicide or died through this overdose of nutmeg that she took. And nutmeg can be abused. This myristicin molecule, there is a theory that it can be converted into an ecstasy-like drug by the body. And if you eat enough nutmeg, it will become toxic. This myristicin will be very toxic. And so it can eventually kill you. And the people doing the autopsy on this poor woman, when they were performing the autopsy, they could smell nutmeg on her, and that is why they ran the test that they ran. And just like in the case of caffeine, myristicin is a great insecticide. This was work done at Berkeley, actually, by Casita in the toxicology department. And it shows percent mortality of fruit flies over the first 60 minutes. And then milligrams of myristicin on the X. And you can see it doesn't take much myristicin to kill a vial of fruit flies. And so this helps us understand perhaps at least one reason from the perspective of adaptation, why a nutmeg would bother putting this in its seeds. Protects the seeds from seed predators. That's the hypothesis generated by this graph. And here are the Moluccas, the Banda Islands in what is now Indonesia. Here's a little inset here. And this was the place where things like nutmeg, clove, they were endemic to these islands, which is why they became this flashpoint in geopolitics, right, over the course of the 1400s to the 1700s. And I'll just walk you through that, because what I want you to think about is how a molecule like myristicin could change the geopolitical world, the human world, in ways that are rather extraordinary. So in 1667, there was a treaty between Great Britain and the Netherlands over the control of the last island that Britain controlled in the Bandas, called the island of Rune. And this was because originally the Portuguese came in, colonized the Banda Islands in order to take advantage of the spices and ship them back to Europe, where there was this amazing demand for Asian spices for reasons that are really interesting. And because it was the only place in the world where these trees grew, that was a coveted place. So they very brutally colonized these islands. Eventually, the British kicked the Portuguese out, and then the Dutch kicked the British out, with the exception of Rune. And so this treaty that was signed in 1667, this Treaty of Breda, what the British gave was the island of Rune to the Dutch, and in exchange, the Dutch gave New Netherlands to Britain. New Netherlands, of course, is where New York is. So other things were done by this treaty too. It's not so simple to say nutmeg was traded for Manhattan, but it's kind of true. There's some truth to it, that this molecule, for whatever reason, was so coveted as a cure-all in Europe at the time that it became a thing that was far more valuable than gold, and became a thing that caused the hinging of these major geopolitical events. And it's not just myristicin. So this set in motion a series of other things that eventually led to the world that we have today. You can at least view it through this lens. And the reason is Britain had a pretty good trade with nutmeg for a while, but then it's kicked out. So the problem that occurred was that in Britain, the people were becoming totally addicted to tea, the caffeine in tea. And almost all of the tea was being imported from China. And Britain was buying the tea with sterling. So they developed this huge trade deficit. And we all know that trade deficits drive politics. They can. So Britain was sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. They wanted to correct this trade deficit. How did they do that? Well, they had control of what is now India at the time. And India had poppy plantations that the British started really ramping up, because what they decided they could do is smuggle it into China through the mouth of the Pearl River illegally, because it was sort of in fashion to smoke opium in some sectors of Chinese society at the time. And coupled with that, there was something called the White Lotus Rebellion that was this internal sort of cultish uprising happening in China at the same time. So there were these socio-political events that were sort of problematic in China, linked to all of a sudden very accessible levels of opium. And if you think about these two things, there's a mirroring with the opioid epidemic in the United States also. But But just to give you a sense of how dramatic the flow of opium illegally into China was, and this is a picture of opium. I'll show you a few slides on the levels of opium that were imported and what that eventually caused to occur in China. But before we get there, this is just a picture of the opium poppy. The capsule is sliced by people, and then the next day, latex starts dripping out that contains the morphine, and then it dries on the outside of the capsule. That's scraped off. That's used to produce morphine. And then poppy seeds, of course, come from the exact same plant, and those are used as a culinary food. And morphine is the chemical that is present in the latex of the opium poppy. Here's a picture of the fields of opium, a little bit more on the latex. And this is just to show that flies really don't like it either. So just like the myristicin, they really don't like morphine. Okay, so you kind of see a pattern here. I'm not saying that's why morphine evolved, but it's associated with the flies really not liking it. Um, this is opium imports into China with metric tons on the Y from 1650 to 1880. So this is post, right at the Treaty of Breda, 1667. Check this out. You see this exponential increase almost in the tonnage of opium smuggled by British boats into the Pearl River in China and then brought into interior of China. And this is showing you a warehouse in India where the processing of the opium was occurred, and they were put into these pots that were then put in the boats and brought into the Pearl River. And this is just like an extraordinary thing, right? And eventually through this, Britain rebalances its trade deficit. So this is really good for Britain and really bad for China. And the Chinese emperor had multiple times during this banned the opium, tried to crack down on it. It never really worked. So there was this in 1839, there was this final straw where this Commissioner Lin just put their foot down and they dumped all the opium and all the boats they could find into the Pearl River. And this, of course, sent Britain into a fury. They sent frigates to the Pearl River. They opened fire on the Chinese boats that were there, the Navy, as it were, the junks. And you can see the Opium War taking place in this image that was painted. And this book, Imperial Twilight, that I relied on by Stephen Platt, illuminates this from a historiography perspective. And here's the Treaty of Nanjing, a very lopsided treaty that the Chinese emperor was forced to sign. You can see it's on a boat. And the story there is that what was traded in that treaty included Hong Kong into British hands. So that they would have a permanent way, at least not permanent as we know, but of hundreds of years of time, right? So that the British could get a foothold there and maintain their trade. And so as a result of this and other events that were going on in China, we see the fall of the 2,000-year Qing dynasty over this myristicin, morphine, caffeine trio. We see the rise of communist China. We see eventually things like the opioid epidemic in the United States, the precursors being made in China. We see this whole thing coming full circle as a result of, you could say, this coevolutionary dance between animals and plants and the humans sort of tapping into that war. And then that treaty that was signed with the ink in that pen, along with all other pens at the time, came from oak apples, which are galls made by oak trees in response to a little wasp injecting her venom into the bud of a developing oak tree. And this is happening right now in the Berkeley Hills. And these little galls start developing, the plant's making them, and the little wasp larvae are living inside those galls. And the plant is pumping tannins into that gall. We think the wasp is manipulating the plant to do that so that the tannins are protecting the little grubs that are living in it. Well, someone decided to crush those up in Europe and combine them with iron salts from hot springs or mineral springs. And what they got was ink, iron gall ink or iron oak gall ink. And all of the documents in the Western canon, from the Magna Carta to the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution, are written with these tannins from oak galls that were produced by this arms race, this war between insects and plants. So we can kind of come full circle there when you think about, like, why would a plant make a tannin? For many reasons. And that humans have tapped into that too. So as I close this, we have, from the war of nature to the war of men, we have most delicious poison. And from Saturn's rings to the sequoia's rings of carbon, we have this recapitulation of this war of nature. So I want to thank you all. Thank you to Camille and to Mary for inviting me. And I put a couple of websites up there if you're interested in our research or more on the book.